So next up, out of the gate, we're gonna start with our run showcase, which tips and information that will help us, be more effectively in running our business. And our presenters today are Bill Higley and Caesar Keller. So guys, I'm turning it over to you.
So good morning, everybody. I'm getting my slideshow here, ready to go. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to actually present this with Bill Higley. I'll start by saying that, several months back, Bill approached me saying, hey, wouldn't it be nice to kind of co-present on something? And we're always thinking about how can we combine the lives of our careers of systems and development online along with legal. So today we just wanted to bring you some awareness regarding web accessibility and what that means for small businesses, what that means for everybody. Bill, I don't know if you had any intro words, but what we're going to do is I'm going to start off and then I'm going to hand off the presentation over to Bill. So any intro words from you, Bill?
That's going to work fine, and it'll dovetail nicely. Thank you.
Perfect.
So I will say this, that I do need to add this, that Caesar really took the laboring oar in putting together the beautiful graphics for this presentation. I'm a wordsmith, and pictures are worth 1,000 words, and he's the man.
Appreciate that,
so
Bill.
Take
Thank
it
you
away.
very much. All right, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is, so why care about web accessibility? Starting with the why always makes a lot of sense, right? Well, it should be a real, effective, and stable solution, not only for businesses, but all, including people with disabilities. So this is almost like a fairness or equality situation that we have going on. Technology is great, only if it works. And if it only works for certain people, there's a little disequilibrium that we need to think about. So here is just something to think about, right? Visualize your life without internet. It's pretty difficult, right? There's been some major revolutionary changes as to how we do business, how we communicate, how we digest information. But just think about that for a second. That's a very impactful statement, right? Think about closing your eyes and going, I have to live life without being able to see. Or if you have some impairments and disabilities, technology is already complicated as it is. It's getting better and better, but a lot of us have to learn and get on that learning train of always learning technology and keeping up. Well, imagine if you couldn't even keep up, because it's kind of unfair and it's stacked against you. And that's what we're going to try to talk about today. So there's various disability categories when you start talking about compliance solutions. And today we're specifically talking about web accessibility. So when you access the web and you're trying to do things online, what are the types of impairments that a lot of people are unaware of? So we're not going to cover all of them today, but I listed some there. Blindness, motor disorders, cognitive disorders, color blindness. People immediately go to fully blind, but there's various issues with eyesight and macular degeneration and other diseases where you can have severe partial blindness. So you can see a little bit, but not enough to kind of render things clearly. And that, just the interaction with computers and screens and prompts and everything, that complicates things for people. Epilepsy is one that a lot of people don't think about, like any flashing screen or switching of graphics or certain colors, especially with screens that the hertz that vibrate. Some of these things can cause seizures. Imagine having situations where you're very limited screen exposure because it might trigger a seizure. So again, I'm going to cover some examples of these just to kind of bring awareness to everybody and start those discussions. So the first one is blind and visually impaired, right? This was probably the most recognized in this field. It is difficult to cope with displays. You typically need to increase the media size, the text, or the reading and browsing experience. Typical systems and software that are out and about, even hardware devices, there's a lot of speech recognition software out there that can help. There's Braille keyboards. Sometimes there's other input devices other than a mouse. And and trackpads, which is the common. There's head tracking, and some now they're coming up with a whole bunch of eyeglasses that have eye line movement, and you can actually click by blinking and stuff like that, some of the more advanced stuff. And that's for obviously people that are visually impaired. People that are fully blind, imagine trying to navigate systems without being able to see. That software and those keyboards and those systems of dictation need to have extra coding, extra scripts, extra things that communicate with your system, and they have to be done in a very specific way to work. So if you haven't prepared your systems, these people are going to have a lot of trouble. One note to think about is obviously partial vision loss is something to think about. Immediately people think about just being fully blind, but that's not the only case. The next example is motor disabled. There's a lot of people that deal with limited movement or being able to operate fully with articulations and functions, hands and legs and whatnot. There are diseases such as Parkinson's, there's bone injuries, organ injuries, palsy, even people that have limb amputations. So they don't have hands or arms to be able to manipulate certain devices. So there's a lot of devices that are being programmed and executed as far as hardware and software to help people with these particular disabilities. But imagine not even being able to use a keyboard or a mouse. That's pretty trivial, right? That's very difficult to do. So extremely customizable and flexible tools and systems are needed for this particular group. Again, I kind of highlighted epilepsy. A lot of people don't think about epilepsy as being an issue, but imagine if any flashing or refreshing screens can trigger a seizure. Imagine if you've prepared a ton of amazing content online, but it's all video or something to that effect, and certain people could not render or watch videos because they trigger seizures. They'd prefer more of the traditional reading and scripts and something that is not so animated. Just something to consider as far as how to provide alternate content for several subgroups. So there was an online study that was performed, and they basically did research across 10 million web pages to just start thinking about the average out there of who is compliant and who is not compliant when it comes to web accessibility. And right here we have a little chart of the percentage of web pages that failed based on certain categories. So I'm not going to go into the details of every single category, nor the how you fix it technically, but at least I'll talk a little bit about some examples of why some of these categories are failing and how simple it is to fix some of these things. So for the number one is menus. Every single website out there or system has to have a menu so you can navigate the system. And imagine if that website would not work unless you did the traditional click on the menus. And that's where the problems start. The example here is, remember how I talked about these specialized keyboards and these specialized software things? If you can't navigate the website through just entering keys or right and left arrows, there's certain scripts that you can write to do that. None of those additional assistive technologies work. So people that have these disabilities can't even navigate your website. Images, it's a little bit better, 52% tend to fail. The thing here is that there's tags that you can put along with images, because if you're blind or you have visual impairments and you can't see graphics, or you're colorblind and colors mess up the representation of the data, usually you can have either alternative content or alternative tags that give you a description, almost like metadata. You can't see this banner, you can't see this image, but let us describe what this image is in text format. And that's where those speech readers can read out, this is what this image is, this is what constitutes the message or information inside of that graphic. Pop-ups. We all hate pop-ups, whether we're disabled or not, but imagine not being able to close a pop-up because you can't hit the escape key because you can't navigate with a mouse or a trackpad to close that pop-up down. That's a simple script that can be written, but imagine how annoying it is that the second that the pop-up comes up, all your systems fail because they did not program a keyboard shortcut to be able to close that pop-up. Forms. Going through a lot of forms and filling out information can be very tedious, even for regular people. And there's a lot of form validation. So, oh, you put in the wrong data inside of this field. It's got to be correct before you move to the next step. Well, when you see the prompts and you can navigate the forms normally, not that big of an issue. But what if you can't see? What if you can't click on certain things? What if the speech recognition software cannot tell you what the problem or what field it is that is failing before you can submit that form? It brings everything to a halt. So those are just some examples that I wanted to share. Again, not in a technical format, but a lot of these problems are quite easily fixed by just understanding the scripting and the programming technologies behind those. It's just a lot of times that's considered extra. And when we're building websites or we're building online systems, we make the decision of, well, let's save a little bit of money there, let's save a little bit here, it's going to be a little bit less expensive, but that choice limits people using your system. So just something to think about, to be aware. And by the way, across the 10 million pages, this study, 85% of those websites were based on the United States and Canada. There were also Europe studies and whatnot, but just to share, these statistics hit close to home. And now is where I want to just turn it over to Bill. We're going to kind of move from the technical side that I just described and the whys of why we care a little bit more into understanding the impact of compliance guidelines and the legal aspects. So Bill, happy to pass that over to you, and just let me know when you want me to advance to the next slide.
Thank you, Caesar. Thank you very much. And if you don't mind, I'll just ask you to advance to the next slide. That way I don't have to switch over to sharing my screen. We both have the same presentation on our screens at our desks, but if you'll advance to the next slide whenever I'm finished, that'll make for a better continuity of the program. But thank you very much. So building off what Caesar said, a couple of preliminaries. Andy had a question about statistics about the number of disabled users and the prevalence of disabled users and how widespread this problem is. So this group here that promulgates the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines can tell you that. It is a consortium of industry developers and others interested in developing these accessibility and systems for disabled users. So you can access the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines at a website. It's w3.com. And if you go there, you'll find the W3C, which is called the consortium. It studies the issues and makes recommendations and guidelines for developers. So this is somewhat like the ISO 9000 certification in industry and in manufacturing. So if you consider an analogy here, to ISO 9000, ISO 9000 is based on core principles of management and data management and systems. Similarly, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are based on 4 core principles. And these are that the information must be perceivable by the disabled user. The user interface components and navigation must be operable. So Caesar talked about navigation devices, about alternate input devices. They must be operable. Perhaps that's through auditory connections and resources. Perhaps that's through motor navigation modifications, but they must be operable. The user must be able to operate the interface. Thirdly, the information and the operation of the interface must be understandable. If they can't comprehend it, and perhaps they can't comprehend it because they can't see it, that perhaps they can't comprehend it because they can't get to a particular place on a web page, on a screen, on a live button or a live link to understand it. And so that gets to issues of nomenclature, taxonomy, terminology. How many of us have gone off on research and tried to do research, but we can't figure out what was in the indexer's mind to begin with. And so the person who wrote the index used terminology that we didn't think of. And so that's where you get into the issue of understandable. And finally, the content must be robust enough to be interpreted by a wide range of assistive technologies. So there are lots of assistive technologies out there, but if your content only connects with a portion of them, then you leave out a wide range of users who use other assistive technologies, whether it's auditory or visual or motor-based input devices. Caesar, if we can go to the next slide, we're going to look at two examples here, the Domino's Pizza case and the 20th Century Fox case. So the in Domino's Pizza, we have a blind customer who sued under the Americans with Disabilities Act, alleging that their mobile app and website don't work with that user's assistive software. We're not told what the assistive software was. We don't know what that was. That's not in the report of the case. But the cause of action was brought under the ADA. There were other parts of the lawsuit which really don't pertain to our discussion here. But if you think of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there are regulations promulgated under that act by the Department of Justice. So there's an analogy here. The analogy on the one hand is the relationship between OSHA and ISO 9000. On the other hand, we have here the ADA and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So in each case, there is a legal framework which applies to a limited subset of examples, but then there's an industry consortium which casts a very broad net and applies to a wide variety. So the ADA here applies. The highlights of this case are that the ADA applies to what are called places of public accommodation. So there are two elements to that. Number one is a place. The word place is important here. And second, public accommodation. So in this case, the court held that the Domino's app and the website are intended to connect customers and potential customers to the place at which goods and services are sold, in this case, pizza and food, so that the prospective customer cannot access or purchase food except by going to the place or by relationship to a place. So to the extent that the mobile app and the website connect customers to the place at which goods or services are offered, then the ADA applies. So the ADA requires the use of auxiliary aids and services to allow, from the regulations, full and equal enjoyment of goods and services by disabled customers. So in the example of buildings and places, we see those all the time. Those are railings, doorways, for restrooms, signage, braille signage, lots of other examples of auxiliary aids and services. That's what all those things are called, to allow full and equal enjoyment of what is offered at that place or in connection with that place by disabled customers. So in this case, Domino's was faced with a task of addressing its mobile app and its website. So the next slide shows a contrasting case. So in this case, the 20th Century Fox Film Corporation, an employee sues the employer alleging that employer-provided insurance discriminated against disabled employees. Something about the employer-provided insurance was alleged to be discriminatory. And again, in this case, we're not told what the features of that insurance were. We're not told in what way it discriminated against employees. However, the court in that case held, by contrast, that employer-provided insurance is not connected either to the physical office of the employer or the insurance company. In other words, the employee did not have to avail themselves or access the physical location of 20th Century Fox in order to avail themselves of this benefit. So the case shows the distinction between application to places of public accommodation. So in this case, no connection to a physical space. Now, granted, 20th Century Fox does indeed solicit the public, but the lawsuit here was not brought by a member of the public. The lawsuit was brought by an employee of 20th Century Fox who is not a member of the public. So the distinction then is access to physical places by members of the public. Now, the next slide shows an example of an entire industry, and I cite the gaming industry here. Caesar and I looked over this this industry, because these are very obvious examples, very illustrative examples of vendors and businesses who are most certainly soliciting the public for sales of goods and services. But in the gaming industry, there's no access required to a place. It is totally over the web. And the other aspect of the gaming industry is that the user experience is itself the product. It is not a product for sale. So in the case of Domino's, the user experience with the app and the website are not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to buy food and pizza, and to get the customer to buy food and pizza. In the gaming industry, the point of the exercise is the participant, the gamer's experience with the website and with what is on the screen. So even though there is no applicability of the Americans with Disabilities Act, this industry provides an example how they have gone well beyond what the legal requirements are by way of providing additional, these are primarily input devices, head tracking systems, adaptive controllers for Xbox, that's for a specialized game, access controllers. There are all sorts of other assistive controllers that enable participants with limited hand motion to input. These are like joysticks with multiple controls. They look like musical instruments almost. So that those are primarily input devices. Then the output from the computer will come in the form of voice or conversion of visual to audio and other similar types of signals, beeps, audio signals, other things that permit tracking of elements on the screen interface. So that in this situation, we can go to the next slide, Caesar. So if I am if I have a business, then of course, should I be concerned about compliance? Who am I reaching? Who am I not reaching? And remember that the key from the ADA, the key to ADA applicability is whether your customer has to access a physical place in order to avail themselves of your services. So for example, in consulting services, in agency relationships like insurance or other services where they're not connected to a physical place, then the ADA doesn't apply to that. However, to the extent you want to provide a service for all or maximize the potential audience, then these issues should probably concern you. The other thing is that web technologies, and there are a tremendous number of websites that point these out, or that make these available. Kara commented earlier that there are quite a number of websites, and so those are accessible for those who want to be aware of this. Those tools are there to allow you to reach a wider audience and to communicate with the widest possible number of potential customers. Caesar and I are both open for questions. I presume we have some time for questions. If anyone has a question.
There was a question from Dale for Caesar. How effective are most web hosting platforms at addressing these accessibility issues?
It's gotten a lot better, Dale. I know I started doing some 508 compliance and stuff back in the early 2000s. And basically everything that you had there was custom writing and custom scripting and custom programming. But as some of the posts that I see on the chat, there's tons of plugins, there's tons of tools, and a lot of the systems nowadays come with parameters to input extra metadata and provide content in multiple formats. So that's all good. Really, the challenge comes down to not everyone that's putting together a website understands how to properly connect all that stuff out. So that's part one. Part two is the complexity of the website. Websites in general are pretty easy, specifically marketing websites. But when you start getting into complicated websites that have operations and business and transactions and a lot of forms and things that you're doing heavy lifting operations behind the scenes, those websites are just, it's harder. It gets harder and harder. And then the last aspect, imagine when you're building custom applications, it just gets to the next level. So for websites, I think it's pretty good, especially compared to when I started, which is nice.
Caesar, Dale mentioned web hosting platforms, but the onus is actually on the website owner or creator, correct?
That's correct.
Not the hosting company.
No, it has nothing to do with the hosting company. Some hosting companies can combine, like they're providers of not only the platform that you're using to execute your website, such as WordPress. There are some deals where you get the WordPress plus the hosting, and it's kind of like a package deal, but it's never on the hosting side. It's always on the owner and the people that are managing the website. Good clarification, Will. Thanks.
The one other point to add is that on the relationship between the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and the ADA, it's the same as the relationship between OSHA and ISO 9000. That is that conformity to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is no defense to an action under the ADA, to an enforcement action or to a lawsuit under the ADA. It may, if you conform to those guidelines, it may get you to a place where you're going to avoid complaints, but if a complaint comes, it's not a defense to a lawsuit. And that relationship is a general matter of law on the relationship between consensual standards on the one hand and legal requirements on the other. So there is that relationship. However, conformity with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines may be seen as a very desirable thing. In other words, you want to tout that, and so the companies that are ISO 9000 or one of those series of standards compliant, they don't hesitate to make that a point in advertising.
One comment from Deb Bocamper, very helpful for my clients. This is a great resource, so appreciate you guys doing that. Thad James said, will these, it just moved up. Will these compliance suggestions eventually become rules/laws in the future?
I can see that happening. Because generally what happens is the way the law develops is through legislative investigations, legislative committee investigations. The but industry publications and industry consortia and conventions like this are generally ahead of legislative developments, and they furnish material for consideration in legislative developments. That's exactly the way it happened in OSHA, so that industry guidelines and industry developments eventually made their way into regulations for accessibility. And so I can see that happening, definitely.
One extra point is I've had clients that are international, and there are different regulation bodies and rules that you have to follow in different countries. So the European Union and certain European countries actually have more progressive, advanced regulations and compliance than the United States. So if you're in an international business, you might have conflicting, well, what rules do I abide by? Well, you have to abide by the most progressive ones. So some of these international companies that have a lot of business in Europe, they're having to follow ADA compliance stuff that is not necessarily a rule here in the United States. So it's just a matter of time till it catches up.
If you look at any electronic device and you see that little label at the bottom, and you see the CE and you see all those other little, those are a type of trademark. Those are compliance marks, and when people are compliant, they want to make it known.
So we're about out of time, but Andy did want to know if technically challenged was considered a disability.
Just for Andy.
Just for Andy. All right.
It is interesting that, you know, if you go to just one quick example is in browsers, say for example Google Chrome, if you go to the three little dots in the upper right hand corner and you pull that menu down and it's more, you will eventually, picking through menus and submenus, you will eventually get to accessibility features. But it's a long way from the first page, from the home page. And so that's what this is all about. People with those disabilities would never be able to make it through those menus to get to the accessibility choices.